Nickelodeon.
Are you ready, kids?
Aye, aye, Captain!
I can't hear you!
Aye, aye, Captain! I know, you see.
One of the biggest kids' TV channels and networks, being only beaten by the likes of Disney, is Nickelodeon. A channel with a long history of shows and entertainment that I, along with many of you, all grew up watching and would be massive parts of our childhoods and early teenage years, being full of nostalgia and possibly even shaping how we would develop in the years of our lives that would follow, with shows like iCarly, Drake and Josh, The Amanda Show and many, many more classics that you could just reel off for hours on end, containing some of the highest ratings in kids' TV show history. But take a quick glance behind the curtain of the perfect dream of a life depicted by these shows into the reality of what goes on whilst making them, and you'll see a different reality entirely. Because in the past year, more and more people have become aware of what would really go on behind the scenes of these popular children's shows, and it's far worse than you would think. As if being thrust into the limelight at such a young age wouldn't be difficult enough for these child stars, already having to deal with a level of fame and pressure unheard of to the regular person watching these shows, topping it all off with being surrounded by some of the most predatory people imaginable in Hollywood, and seeing how the industry truly treats these child actors with such disregard. And behind almost every popular show you watched growing up was one man, part of the creation for all of them, and that was Dan Schneider. As many of you may have eventually picked up from the end credits of these shows, the name Dan Schneider was plastered on almost every single popular Nickelodeon show since the 90s, with the likes of iCarly, Drake and Josh, Zoey 101 and many more being created by his production company. Now Dan knew how to make a perfect show for kids. Even now the shows hold up very well upon rewatching them. At the time they were great and they still are to this day, being full of humour and entertainment, and today also being full of nostalgia and are still clipped to be used in memes to this day over a decade later. So nobody was to expect that this same man, who entertained millions of children all across the world, could be hiding a dark secret. That was at least until 2022, when many of the child stars that we'd grown up watching would begin to speak up about their experiences on set whilst working on his shows. So seeing that there was some similarities and shared experiences between these actors, the shows they'd worked on and the people behind the scenes, Investigation Discovery decided to look a little deeper into all of this and look further into the Nickelodeon rabbit hole to see what would really happen behind the scenes of these shows, and what they would find would turn out to be much worse than was expected, with it all being published in their series Quiet on Set, The Dark Side of Kids TV. Many of the details explained in the show detail how poorly these actors were treated, which arguably you could say would be expected from Hollywood, not that it makes it excusable at all, but it wouldn't be unheard of to hear that a relatively unheard of actor would be treated poorly and be surrounded by power-hungry narcissists. But what's shown in the series would barely even scratch the surface and expose some of the real horrors going on behind the scenes. Now, one thing you may have noticed over the years, not just in Hollywood but work and life in general, is that the more beneficial you are to everyone, the more likely you are to get away and be excused for certain behaviours. And that would definitely be the case for the likes of Dan Schneider, with the shows he was creating being some of the most popular series on kids TV even to this day, and his catalogue spanning multiple decades from the 90s to the 2010s. He was an incredibly prized asset for the Nickelodeon executives and shareholders. But as time goes on and the kids on the shows and those watching at home would look back on what they used to watch in their childhood, they would begin to notice and recognise that some of the content they were watching and the actors were having to take part in would be quite inappropriate to say the least, with many people having pointed out Dan's obsession with kids' feet, being shown on many episodes a bit too regularly just to be a coincidence. One of the first child actors Dan would come across would be Amanda Bynes, someone many of you may know of for crashing out in her later years after her child acting days, which was a more than understandable outcome when you realise many of the things that she went through. Reportedly, Dan would initially spot Amanda on the show All That, and would then see a tape of her performing a stand-up routine at a young age. He would apparently become fixated with Amanda, and she would later star in her own show, aptly named The Amanda Show. Now Amanda, who was 13 at the time of the show starting, would be written in to star in some very inappropriate scenes even for the time, with one of the most infamous scenes being a segment where she would interview men who were much older than her in a hot tub, one of these men being Dan himself at one point. Perhaps some convenient script writing there for Mr. Schneider. Now admittedly, not that this again makes it excusable, But this was before the likes of the Me Too movement, where people such as Harvey Weinstein would be outed for their predatory nature, and there was much more trust in the many realms of media in general. Something that today would be a bizarre concept to many, myself included, with the heavily politicized and agenda-pushing nature of many media outlets nowadays. However, with the erosion of this trust, people have begun to question many of the things they were shown growing up, with this hot tub segment being one of those things. With a writer from the show, Jenny Kilgan, alleging that Dan Schneider had forced her to watch pornography and adult content during her time working with it. She would also later sue Nickelodeon for gender discrimination, relating to some remarks allegedly made to her from Dan Schneider. Initially, when Jenny started working for Nickelodeon, she saw it like many other people would, a dream job for anyone wanting to get ahead in the media industry. But over time, the idyllic picture in her mind and the dream she had created of working there would slowly begin to fade as she started to see the reality of what would go on behind the scenes of a Schneider production, with Jenny being forced to split a salary with another female writer when they both began working there, because apparently Dan would only hire them both if they did so, something that nobody seemed to care about at the time, and that Jenny seemed to take as just a small cost to get her started in the company. And whilst this wasn't perhaps the peak of Dan's power and influence in Nickelodeon, he still wasn't someone to be questioned in the company about his decisions at the time. So if that's what he wanted, that's what happened. Dan would also make jokes and insults towards individuals that he worked with, as if to break down their self-esteem, including jokes targeted at the few women working in his company, along with reportedly sending multiple messages to the women working for him, asking them for favours such as massages in return for helping them to further their careers, like putting their sketches in the show and crediting them. Now, like I mentioned, being beneficial to people allows you to get away with many things that you shouldn't. And with Dan bringing in millions every year to Nickelodeon, they didn't want to lose him. So they brought out the lawyers whenever a new lawsuit came their way and would settle them. Exactly what they did with the gender discrimination lawsuit. Whilst this would temporarily remove Dan's and Nickelodeon's problems, it would only allow the problems and actions to grow and be put onto future actors and set workers. Many of these future actors working under Dan being written to perform some of the inappropriate scenes, like Amanda, would be under 16 and in a very vulnerable position, with shows such as Victorious featuring some of these young actors and containing many of these inappropriate scenes, with the likes of Ariana Grande being used for a lot of them. As in one scene, she would be written to try and fit her foot in her mouth, further solidifying the belief of Dan Schneider having a foot obsession. Many of these scenes that just Ariana Grande would perform are incredibly inappropriate to watch back, and it only gets worse looking back at the performances from the other actors on different shows as well, with one scene from Zoey 101 where the actress has a tube of goo shot over her face, where she later explains that the boys on set had described it as a certain adult shot, and also explains that allegedly the actors weren't allowed to say no to anything written into the scripts. Dan was easily one of, if not the most important asset to Nickelodeon. He knew how to make a hit show for children, but this ability to get away with everything would allow him to build the confidence into believing he could get away with just about whatever he wanted, which for a long time he could. But inevitably, the house of cards begins to falter before falling entirely. One of the first big outrages, which would happen over Twitter, would be when the show Sam and Cat, starring Ariana Grande again and Jeanette McCurdy from iCarly, would post a tweet asking for their followers, who would likely be mostly children, to write on the bottom of their feet, take a picture, and send it to them. Why they wanted these pictures of likely just children's feet and what benefit they provided was pretty much impossible to figure out, which led people to assume, not necessarily incorrectly, that they would only be needed to satisfy some desire of a particularly foot-obsessed worker at Nickelodeon. This basically confirmed to almost everyone that Dan had an obsession with specifically kids' feet, something that would again be confirmed by a Zoey 101 actress who would state that Dan would allegedly go around his sets, offering to pay the children working there for pictures of their feet. Over time, Dan's immunity would slowly begin to fade away. His overconfidence in getting away with whatever he wanted would slowly begin to land him in hot water and damage his almost untouchable aura, with him posting pictures of some female actresses' feet to Twitter, which would lead to internal investigations being carried out in 2013, but he would continue to work on shows through it all, still being offered protection, no matter how difficult he was making it. That wouldn't stop more internal investigations being carried out in 2017 during the Me Too movement, due to his alleged sexual behaviours. Although no evidence had been found of inappropriate sexual behaviour, whether you want to believe that or not, it did find proof of verbal abuse in the workplace from Dan, which any form of abuse is not what you want to hear, but definitely not from someone who works majoritively with children. Schneider would eventually have his contract terminated with the company in 2018, but this would hardly be bad news for him, as he would still allegedly receive a $7 million payout. The termination would still be too little too late, as this was already after multiple decades of his being a producer on these kids' shows. Any damage had already been done. After the termination, Dan Schneider would begin a sort of damage control period of his life, trying to cover for himself in multiple interviews, stating that his relationships with many people over multiple decades wouldn't have been possible if he wasn't such a good guy. But that didn't stop the former child actors who had worked with him from still telling their stories, with one actress alleging that most of the shows were filmed in Florida due to the child labour laws being far more relaxed there than in many other states, along with another actor stating that he was fired due to his mum being on set and trying to protect him from what she saw as a predatory group surrounding him. Allegedly, this would be something that child actors would be specifically hired for, how much control the production team could have over the children without the parents getting involved. Now, for the most part, a lot of this would be kept relatively quiet, at least until Quiet on Set would be released and bring everything into the public eye. The series would highlight many of the issues and abuse faced by not just child actors, but actors in general in Hollywood. The depraved things these actors and show workers are forced to do by top executives to try and get ahead in the industry. For some, it works and they can go far, but for many, they're just thrown to the side, forced to live with the abuse and mistreatment they've suffered with next to nothing to show for it. Hollywood for years has been known to be a cesspool of some of the worst that humanity has to offer, and that doesn't seem to be something that will change anytime soon. The cycle of it all just continues to churn round, with those at the top staying exactly where they are, occasionally making a sacrifice of one of their own, in this case being Dan Schneider, to look as if they're making some changes, but in reality, everything stays the same. The masses are satisfied for a brief period of time and are happy to carry on as if the problem is solved and that it will never happen again. But in reality, the problem persists and the Hollywood machine continues to churn out new victims every day.